Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today. Brought to you by AI Group.
Hello, I'm James Scotland, coming to you today from Yungabar language region. And this is the Business Improvement Podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time when we're implementing the 3 Ds, digitalisation, decarbonisation, and the diversification of our risk profile, especially in our extended supply chains. Each fortnight, I delve into different sections of the end-to-end supply chain. I chat with fascinating and interesting people, and we try to have some fun along the way. Now, as I've said to you before, up until the 1970s or so, businesses did everything they could in-house. As much as possible, businesses handled all aspects of production and distribution within the business. They had engineers, mechanics, fitters and turners, design people, time and motion experts, procurement staff, big warehouses holding everything conceivable, fleet managers, human travel arrangers, sales planners, and so much more. They even had, believe it or not, employees staffing the canteen. And some businesses even had a much-loved tea lady bringing tea and biscuits to office staff, kind of their own version of today's flight attendants, bringing the tea and bickies. And all of this was managed and coordinated and planned by general managers. Over time, everything not regarded as the core functions of the business have been outsourced. And the general managers of then are now chief operating officers or supply chain managers or business improvement managers, looking to gain maximum effectiveness from the complex and dynamic labyrinth of relationships called business today. This podcast addresses that question. How do we make all of this work in a way that makes our businesses sustainable and resilient despite the constant disruptions and changes? And this, of course, means that every business is now influenced by changes in industry and changes in the wider economy. With all this interaction in modern business, we can really say no one is an island. We're all interrelated. So let's go back to our early business studies. And would everyone please open your textbooks to Chapter 7, Macroeconomics. According to the World Bank, macroeconomics focuses on, quote, the performance of economies, such as changes in economic output, changes in inflation, interest rates, and the balance of payments. It says social equity and sustainable growth, are only possible with sound monetary, fiscal, and political policies. With that in mind, and given the importance of the wider economic conditions that affect supply chain and business improvement managers, it's with great pleasure I welcome back to Supply Circles one of Australia's foremost experts on Australian and global macroeconomics, everyone's favourite CEO, the Chief Executive of Australian Industry Group, Innes Willox. Hello, Innes. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, James. After an intro like that, I don't know where to go next, but great to talk to you again.
We've got a lot to talk about today. I'm really excited to cover a lot of issues. Probably one that's on a lot of people's minds, though, is that there's elections all around the world going on at the moment. This year is the year of elections. And there's even a lot of elections happening in Australia. We're going to have one in Queensland. I think Victoria and a couple other states have got elections. So that probably means that you get quite busy. Let's start with an easy question. When's the federal election and who's going to win?
Well, after that intro, I guess you've sort of billed me as sort of the great economist who knows everything about everything. One thing I don't know. One thing I don't know is when the next election will be, but I can tell you when I think it will be, and I don't think it will be this year. It will be next year.
Uh-huh.
There had been a lot of speculation going back through late June and through July about the possibility of an election this year, but that was predicated on a couple of things happening, and they probably haven't happened. And the Prime Minister's options, and it's only the Prime Minister who knows when the next election will be, nobody else, despite what everyone thinks. There had been a lot of speculation that there might be an election in December of this year, specifically December the 7th, but I'd suggest, James, it'll be pushed into next year, which will take the government pretty much through to full term in May next year because of the state of the economy as much as anything else. And the early election speculation had been predicated on there being a clear reduction in inflation, the hope of interest rate cuts through the back half of this year, and a sort of a clear direction that the economy was picking up steam and getting better. And we haven't seen that yet. In fact, it's probably moved the other way, if anything else, unfortunately, that we're going to see higher rates for longer because of driven by higher interest inflation that we would have liked for longer. So now a lot of the betting is a federal election in May next year, which is when it's due, either May 3, 10 or 17, which May 17 is the last possible date you can have the election. Some chance in March, but there's a few things to get out of the way. There's a Northern Territory election later this year soon, which people forget about, and then a Queensland election towards the end of October. So there is election season coming upon us, probably just not a federal election. Governments go to elections when they think they'll win, and it's not clear yet who that the government thinks it would win the next election. So the second part of your election question was who would win. Well, a lot of the smart money at the moment is on a hung parliament, on a minority government, and the question is what colour or how that minority government would look. And that's simply because the maths indicate that the government has a 2-seat majority. Governments, we don't have a great history of first-term governments increasing their majorities. In fact, they usually go backwards. And if history repeats itself, then we'd probably find ourselves with a minority government post the next election. That's just how the electoral map looks at the moment. There's all sorts of things we could get into around redistributions and the like. But, if you were to have a quiet dollar here or there on an election outcome, I'd put it on a minority government almost certainly after the next election.
What does that mean for business?
That's the really good question, James, because business likes and thrives on certainty and stability. And a minority government would lessen that certainty and that stability. There would be less certainty around policy outcomes, and there'd be less stability because there'd be less certainty around those policy outcomes. Governments in a minority situation would have to negotiate everything through the parliament. Now, people would say, but don't they do that anyhow at the moment? They don't control the Senate. But when you don't control the House of Representatives either in terms of legislative outcome, then you have much less certainty around what you can put to the the House of Representatives. So it just would make governing harder. It would make outcomes harder for businesses to predict. And this gets us to where you were going with your rather flattering introduction of me. But the main point of it is that macroeconomics and geopolitics now matter more than ever in terms of business decisions and business thinking around what's next. Because what would occur in the Australian context is what those who play in this space call an increase in political risk. And political risk means, that businesses would naturally become more cautious around things like investment, job creation, and making decisions that they would believe they have certainty around to grow their business. So what it would probably mean at a macro level, to use the term, James, is that business would be more likely than not to pull their horns in and basically take a see what happens perspective on the world.
Yeah, I know when I was in business, just give me certainty. Which way are you going to go? When I don't know, it makes it harder. A thought occurred to me while you give me the answer. You spent a bit of time working in the halls of government. How much time, if I'm a minister, if I'm a federal minister and I've got 4 or 5 or 6 different portfolios, which often happens, how much time do I really have to spend on making sure we get re-elected? How much time do I dedicate to the managing part and also the election part? How does it work?
Well, the reality is that we're in election season now. Whether the election is late this year or at some point in the first 5 months of next year, and we really have entered that from the time of the May federal budget. That was a year to go. We have 3-year terms in Australia. The third year is primarily spent working with an eye to the next election. We don't usually go the full 3 years. The fact that we did between 2019 and 22 was a rarity, if not an anomaly. As I said, prime ministers will go to the polls when they think they can win. But that last year is really spent on trying to set up for the election, both from a government and an opposition perspective. Government is trying to create the circumstances for them to win. The opposition is in a very clear period of policy development and formation and starts to put out their policy approaches. So when you think of the 3-year cycle, year 1 is getting set up, year 2 is actually doing stuff, year 3 is preparing for the future. That's how the cycle works. So we're in that period now. While we're looking ahead though, James, you've got to govern on a day-to-day basis and stuff happens that you have to deal with.
Well, the stuff that happens includes people like Innes Willox saying, what the hell is going on with the CFMEU? Do you want to talk about that for a minute? Or?
Yeah, no, happy to. So the CFMEU, to anyone who's spent any time in and around either directly or tangentially around construction, what you've read about about the CFMEU over the past couple of weeks is not news. It's not news to anybody. It's an affirmation of what everyone has understood or directly known to be going on. It's a tough industry. It's an industry which is really open to risk, quite frankly. You're dealing with a lot of taxpayer dollars. You're dealing with a lot of health and safety risk. You're dealing with tight timeframes and deadlines. And you're trying to if you're a constructor, get the job done. And quite frankly, over the years, the CFMEU has taken advantage of that and has been able to impose its will through, walking off the job, walking away from jobs, making the life of the contractor and the subcontractors very hard. Because they have had the upper hand. If you don't have the labour to deliver on a job like this, you're not going to get it done, and you're going to get penalised as a constructor. So this is not new. What's new is that it has been ventilated in a way that's really seeped into the public consciousness. People have been revolted and disgusted at what they have read and heard about, and they're thinking, hang on, my kids work in that field, or my grandkids work in that field, or my husband works in that field. Construction's a big employer in the Australian economic context. So they are thinking, hang on, is that what they have to put up with at work all the time? Well, I don't want that anymore. And it's a tough industry too. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, the suicide rate among construction workers is 4 to 5 times the national, what you might call, unfortunately, average, and you've got to think the work conditions contribute a lot to that. So we've seen what all of us have known for a long time come into the public consciousness, and that has forced the hand of the federal government to act and react. And we're in the process now of the CFMEU construction division being put into administration. That means it will be administered by an outside person, and it's a lawyer, a Melbourne-based lawyer, is going to take over the administration of the CFMEU. He is going to run it as a union. He has been tasked with ridding it of the criminal and other menacing elements within the CFMEU nationally, and to make it a lawful union, a strong union. I don't think through the administration process you're not. I know you're not going to see the end of the construction division of the CFMEU, because employers themselves say that they want a strong union or unions preferably, that they can deal with on site to get stuff done. If you're running a big project, say it's a 20-kilometre road building project, you need to be able to work as an employer with representatives of that workforce. They come and go, they're disparate, they're on the job for a long time. You've got to have an agency that you can deal with. So this administration will attempt to clean up the CFMEU. It's got 3 years to do it. We think it will take longer than that, but it's got an initial 3-year period to do that. And we'll be working very closely with the administrator, the Fair Work Commission, which oversees the administration process, and government, to try to make sure that the administration is successful. If we don't have a strong construction sector that includes a lawful union, this is where a lot of the productivity challenge as a country that we face, that's where the problems come from. Productivity in construction went down 2.9% in 2023. That's an enormous decline in productivity, and that impacts our economic prospects and our economic success. So it's in everybody's interests that we get this right, that we weed out the corruption, the criminality within the CFMEU, and we try to get things back onto an even footing. I know where you're going to ask me next, why don't they just deregister them? The answer to that is, if you deregister them without getting too geeky and technical on it for you, James, it just means that those who are currently involved in the CFMEU, who you want to get out of the union permanently, can still operate as unregistered bargaining agents and so they're not got rid of at all. They can still operate. And then we've seen it before when the BLF got deregistered in 1986, the Builders Labourers Federation, they just phoenixed into essentially what is the construction division of the CFMEU now. So it doesn't solve the problem. What you have to do is to try to solve the problem at its root cause, and its root cause is trying to get rid of those and keep out those criminal and intimidatory elements of the CFMEU that are in place now.
Yeah, there's a few good points in there, and thank you for such a detailed answer. I think that businesses and unions that work together make for an effective and resilient sort of business. I worked in transport and operations in New South Wales, and we had a great working relationship with the then Secretary of the TWU, and our business thrived, and so did the union. Hello, Tony Sheldon. Not many people here praised for Tony, but he was a good guy to work with.
But your point is the right one. I mean, if you have a good union that genuinely represents its members on a site and works cooperatively with management, not opposed to management. You see it all the time in the CFMEU stuff. The bosses give you nothing. Employers are this, that, and the other. Some of the language is just off the charts appalling. That's not a way to have a constructive relationship which benefits the economy as a whole, the constructor, and the workforce. That's what you want to do. So there's all sorts of other things you can do around the sector to lift productivity in construction. But to have that meaningful relationship between workforce through their representatives and the employer is really important. And I always say, James, now, look, I spend a lot of my time being critical of some union behaviour, but there are so many people in the union movement who work really hard for their members. They work constructively. Their head and their hearts are in the right place, and they do a lot of good work. And we do, people say, oh, let's all get rid of unions and the world would be a better place. It doesn't work like that. That's a pipe dream, but you've got to have a relationship that works.
But 100% what we have to get rid of is criminality and crime and bullying and those sort of things, because they are, going back to Chapter 7 microeconomics, just bad for the economy. It's just an inefficient way to run things.
Well, it is, because you're not going to attract the best and the brightest. You're not going to achieve cultural change. One of the big things in the construction sector is to attract more women into the sector more broadly, not just onto building sites, but more broadly. I mean, quite frankly, it's incredibly off-putting, when you hear of these stories, and you can just hear, as soon as the stories came out, it's been hard enough to get women into the construction sector in any case. But as soon as these conversations or these stories came out, you could hear the conversations around the country saying to girls, well, you're not going into engineering or anything building related, because if that's what you'd have to put up with, we're not going to have it, as parents. And the kids themselves would say that. So this is why it's really important to basically dig and root this stuff out.
The other area in which you've been very active lately, and in fact AI Group and many of our members have been concerned with, and particularly unprepared, has been the recent changes to workplace laws in Australia, particularly at the federal level. AI Group has a new advertising campaign regarding this issue. Let's play it now and then we can discuss.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying workers could result in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee has the right
employees will have the right
to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Wow, that's a good ad. What are these changes to workplace laws? What are the issues and why are you so concerned?
Well, this is called Tranche 3 of the workplace relations law changes to the Fair Work Act that the federal government has introduced through this parliament. So the first tranche came in 2022, which was to allow for multi-party bargaining, that is for unions to represent their workforces across different employers and to rope those employers into one agreement to pay workers a set amount, can make conditions the same, basically to bring employers together who are in some way comparable. Might be geography, it might be sector, it might be size within an overall sector. Lots of unknowns there. But that law came in 2022 and we've started to see that now come through. It always takes time for this to happen. And when people said to me after it happened, was when it was brought in late 22, nothing's happened, nothing's changed. That is a complete misunderstanding of how workplace relations work. You have to have an end to the enterprise bargaining agreement within different workplaces to allow a new bargaining to be established. So all of that takes time. So you're seeing it now come through different sectors of the economy, in the care sector, parts of the construction sector, in the fast food sector. There are now union attempts to sort of bind employers together and to put sort of one condition on all of them. So that was tranche 1. So that's happening now. Tranche 2 was sort of broader. It was sort of around the demonisation of labour hire was a really important part of that legislation. And there were a whole range of other measures that are now starting to flow into the economy too, which make it harder to employ and retain people. Tranche 3 looks at a whole range of different things and it starts to come into effect from August 26 this year, so just a couple of weeks away, and we're getting very close. And that looks to do things like change the definition of employment, what an employee is. So that definition has been changed. Change the relationship that employers have with their casual workforce. And so now that you can't employ somebody as a casual on a sort of a regular pattern of hours and of work, that's going to be a huge change within the workplace. There are other changes impacting that employment relationship that are coming into place. There is a new union right of entry provision coming into place, which gives unions much greater access into workplaces, whether they're unionised or how unionised or not they are, which is obviously going to empower unions when they believe in inverted commas, there has been a case of a wage underpayment, that they were able to come in to workplaces. So that's a massive change. And then coming down the track further is still being finalised is what the change that I'm sure everyone has heard of around what's known as the right to disconnect, the right for an employee to say to an employer, no, you cannot contact me outside of work hours. And that's still being worked through exactly what that means, as is a lot of this. And for us, we are at AI Group, we are working this through within the confines, particularly of the Fair Work Commission at the moment, to try to get some structure around all of this so that employers know what they're dealing with. And it's sort of kind of crazy to us, James, that sort of a week or so out from new legislation coming into place, employers still don't know what they're dealing with and what their rights are. To change does it fundamentally change the relationship between themselves and their workforce. So we've had employers say to us, so on August the 26th, do I have to convert all my casual employees to part-time employees? That changes the working relationship. The answer to that is no. But employers are just trying to work through what it all means. And with that comes employees having to work through what it all means. And the feedback very strongly to us, James, from employers is that it's going to mean more dislocation within workplaces. It's going to make it harder for them to employ people, harder for them to retain people, less incentive for them to employ people. We think, again, like tranche one, which I started with, you might not see dramatic change overnight, but it will seep through the employment relationship as time goes on, and you'll start to see some fundamental disadvantage occur, particularly we are concerned about for young people trying to find their way into the workplace.
The other issue, which has also had unintended consequences, our colleague Lieutenant Reid always says the only thing that governments ever do successfully is pass the laws of unintended consequences. A recent government initiative certainly comes to this one. In episode 46, I interviewed our colleague from the legal team, Innes Willox, and we talked about safeguarding Australian military secrets with the acronym SAMS. It seems like you've been talking about, that what it meant to do and what it's actually doing is different. Can you talk to that for a minute or so?
Yeah. So SAMS is the Securing Australia's Military Secrets legislation, which the federal government's brought in an effort basically to ensure that we can participate as a country in AUKUS, the building of submarines, and then all of what's known as Pillar 2, a lot of the technology-based cooperative work with the United States and the United Kingdom that comes off the back of AUKUS. Think quantum computing, sonar technology, could go on and on and on, but it's got a whole lot of different legs to it, and that has enormous potential, perhaps even more potential than submarines, but we could talk about that. But anyhow, the legislation's designed to make sure that ex-military officials who are now working outside of the military don't spill secrets to outsiders around Australia's military technology or Australia's military techniques. And this is causing already enormous problems for Australian businesses who employ military personnel. So, if you're an academic who used to be in the military or serve in some function in the military, your ability to go to a lecture in, let's pick a country, India, about, the Second World War, you have to disclose to the federal government who you are, what you're doing, and what your role is, and what you'll be talking about, and you have to get a permit from the federal government that approves you to do this work. So someone who's ex-military who's attending a trade show related to new work within the military that they're doing, they have to get a permit. It is bordering on complete overreach here, and it is causing problems. The penalty for not getting a permit is 20 years jail. 20 years jail. Wow. And the problem is that a lot of people don't know that they're caught up in this or how they're caught up, because there's different rules. If you've been a lawyer in the Air Force, you have to get a permit for a longer time than if you'd been a lawyer in the army, for instance. There's no rationality behind it all. Now, what it is here is an attempt by the government to make sure that we, comply with, what the United States would, they believe, like us to do. The fact is that we've had feedback from the United States at all sorts of levels saying what's going on in Australia is nuts. It's far more than we ever ask for from our ex-military personnel. And it's a complete disincentive for people to go and work in the military, to think that they might need a permit from government to do a job outside the military. So we think this has got short-term consequences of complete disruption for business and for their employees, because all the onus is on the employee, not the business, to get a permit. But it's also a long-term disincentive for Australians to join the military. If Australians wanting to join the military knew that they'd have to go through this later, they wouldn't want to do it. And you're dealing with the bureaucracy here, James. Bureaucracies, love them to bits, but they're notoriously slow. So if you want to get if you have to get a permit to do something, it's a Monday, and you want to get it for a Friday, you're not going to get it. So it's causing just massive disruption already and dislocation and a lot of discontent. And unfortunately, I have to say, the feedback from a lot of businesses is we're just going to ignore this.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the potentials is to say I turn up to you and say, "Hey, look at my CV. I was a captain in the army, and I've got great leadership skills, and I've got broad world skills." And you'll say, "Yeah, no, too hard. I can't hire someone from defence. It's just too hard."
Well, exactly. It's too hard because I'm dealing with you with the unknown. Don't know what I'm going to get you to do into the future. And you might need to get permits left, right and centre for things you do. And that's an uncertainty. We started talking about uncertainties for business. Let me just go with the guy standing next to you who could do the job pretty much as well, but he doesn't have that, that experience in the armed forces, but he's safer. It's easier for us to deal with him. And we don't need to go through this permit nonsense. It's sort of, I hate to say it, it's sort of like needing to get government approval to do your job, and it is. And it's just a crazy situation. And we all know why it's been implemented. It's to deal with one particular country in particular, but it has much wider, broader remit than that. So, we internally we have people who are talking to overseas-based companies all the time, and if they've got any sort of military background, it makes it military or defence, as in Defence Department background. It makes it very difficult for them to do their jobs.
Yeah, crazy. Let's go to a break. When we come back, we'll talk about some other stuff.
If you have supply chain or business improvement challenges, contact AI Group's Business Improvement and Growth Hub. The Big Hub is a library of practical and relevant resources designed to assist member businesses to grow and improve. The Big Hub also includes an extensive network of experienced, pre-qualified business improvement consultants. For more details, contact big@aigroup.com.au. That's big@aigroup.com.au.
Innes, there's a few ongoing challenges for businesses that I'd like to get your thoughts on. We mentioned at the top, according to most economists, inflation is likely to be an ongoing issue, and that's going to affect business. Interestingly, I've been doing a series of speaking events around Queensland, and business people in many areas are reporting really good trading figures. They're saying that they're having a good year. So it seems like demand is strong, but costs are getting higher. How are you seeing it?
Well, I think we can fall into the trap of saying at a macro level things are getting tougher, so therefore everyone must be doing it tough. That's not quite the case. There are a lot of businesses still doing well, but at another level you're seeing business insolvencies on the way up, almost at record levels. You're seeing business starts much smaller and lower than they have been historically. You're seeing businesses starting to make some hard decisions around investments. Investment numbers through the federal budget are forecast to decline quite dramatically this year because businesses are rethinking their priorities. And it's very much sector by sector. And within sectors, different sort of streams of businesses as well who are impacted. The problem is that we have significant inflation within our economy at the moment, and that is driving up costs. And it's costs of doing business. It's costs around insurance, around energy, around rents. They're all going up. And then government taxes and charges are also going up significantly. In Victoria, you've got land tax, which is just crucifying businesses at the moment. You have broader costs of doing business like work cover, premiums going up as well. So all the input costs into running a business that historically have been reasonably manageable are the ones that are going up, which is impacting business. Now, business is sort of what their business is trying to do is absorb where possible, but pass on. And as they pass on and pass through, inflation creates and begets more inflation. So if you're the end consumer, be it Mr. and Mrs. householder or another business, that's where your costs are going up. Then at a macro level, we're seeing increased volatility internationally, the Middle East crisis, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine, lead up to the United States election is causing all sorts of distortions within the international market. And there are others as well. You've seen gyrations in stock markets in the US, in Japan and in Europe. All of those are impacting on sort of business sentiment and outlook. So they're getting by now, a lot of businesses, but they're increasingly worried about what the future holds with all of that volatility, because there's concern that what that future holds is increased cost and less certainty. And that is what is holding business back at the moment. It's not actually what's going on in their business, it's what's going on externally to their business. And going back to where you started, if you studied macroeconomics, you talk a lot about externalities, things outside your control. Those things outside the immediate control of the business are what are impacting more and more on the business on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Our economist, Jeff Wilson, says that being an island a long way from the rest of the world, we're always going to have inflation. It's just part of life of living in an island, but it's just managing that inflation against business and the economy. Yeah, great insights. Thank you for that.
Part of the problem we've got now, James, is that more and more of our inflation is what is known as homegrown. It's created here. So it's those things that I talked about. Taxes, rents, insurances, broader charges, all of that is impacting on business at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. I know that when I was working in Australia, but in Asia, the Asians were always amazed by how expensive land was here. They'd say, the rest of the world was amazed by how expensive land is. They say, we hear you talk about your high wages and the high cost of labour, but we find land as a problem.
We are a high-cost economy. We're a high-cost economy to maintain and run, because with the high costs comes high wages, high benefits as a result of that, which has given us some significant domestic advantages. But it's also been difficult for international companies to work through and work with, to wrap their heads around. And I hear it all the time from overseas-based companies about trying to explain to head office, be it in Denver, Copenhagen or Singapore, how expensive it is just to operate in Australia. And that is a disincentive for the headquarters, wherever it is, to invest more in Australia if our, what they might consider our dead weight costs are so expensive. Now, nobody's saying we should be a low wage economy or a low cost economy necessarily, because that's not where we're going to get competitive advantage. But we have to realise that those costs that we impose on ourselves make it more difficult for businesses to invest and to be competitive when they're trying to get overseas markets as well.
Which leads to another issue in a recent episode. I spoke to Jim Wilson from Shipping Australia, and he argued strongly that it's not container ships that are at fault in terms of global container logistics. It's the ports. And he says that there are many reports out that puts Australian ports at the bottom of productivity. He said in the episode, I encourage people to have a listen, he said that Australian ports were compared like to like. They didn't compare Australian ports to Rotterdam or Long Island, but to other equivalent places, including the amount of investment that's gone on. And we came in very low in terms of productivity. Now, I'm scared to open the Pandora's box of productivity because I know that's your favourite topic. But what's going on with the ports, Innes?
A wise man once explained to me that ports operate in three distinct phases. There's the container vessels coming in, so that's cost one. There's what happens at the port, cost two. And then there's the transport or shipping out of the port, that's cost three. Now, people will argue all the time around our costs. What can we control? We can really control part two and part three, really. International costs of container shipping are a bit beyond our control. But what we've seen is they went through the roof during COVID, 5-6 times fold increases in container shipping costs, come down a bit, but started to go up a bit again. And that goes back to where I was talking about around the distortions around the US election. And what business is seeing is it's not impossible, but it's harder to get container ships and containers down here because there's so much traffic now between the US and China, again, as businesses, particularly in the US, try to work their way through the potential of Trump tariffs, particularly on China, and sort of try to get ahead of the game. So that's making container shipping into Australia more difficult. Ports, yes, we'll get arguments around are they efficient and cost effective or not. The reality is that there are, as from right across our economy, greater costs in terms of our ports. But there are those who would argue that internationally they are on the whole reasonably efficient with some differences in some ports. But there's always an argument to be made for more efficiency when it comes to container movement. And then we've got transport costs on the other end. Very expensive fuel costs of buying trucks, purchasing trucks, very expensive compared to globally. Wages in the sector are high. Warehousing costs are high. So you put all those three together, that's where it comes from. Now, each of those three component parts always point the finger at the other, but when you look at it as a whole, James, we're an expensive place to import into and export out of.
Is there anything we can do?
Well, it comes back to productivity and how do we get productivity through all three elements, particularly element 2 and 3 on our wharves. How do we make our wharves and ports even more efficient? And that comes down to things like working conditions and enterprise agreements reached with our maritime workers and our maritime union, the ability to implement new technologies into ports is really important. I think, we have big variations within the different port operators around the technologies that they use and are able to use depending on where they're at within the EBA cycle and what's been agreed in the past. And then we've got to really look at our productivity in that third part around transport costs, warehousing costs, energy costs, all of those things. Productivity is a multifaceted thing. That's why we talk about multi-factor productivity. It's not just one element, but there's a whole range of things that go into it around skills, around training, around taxation, around energy, around infrastructure. Could go on and on and on. And we've just got to keep chipping away at this or else we will just become less and less competitive than we already are. We are slipping down indexes in terms of global rankings on competitiveness. And, if we're not competitive, as the world moves into a new phase of technology adaptation, so everyone's focused on artificial intelligence, but it's much broader than that. As the world sort of moves into technology upgrades, we need to be at the vanguard of those technology upgrades to make ourselves more efficient and to take advantage of them. That comes back to skilling our workforce, training our workforce, and that's where we've got to start. There's no magic bullet, but we've got ourselves in a situation where we're slipping further and further behind the pack.
A timely warning. Wow, that's amazing, and a nice way to finish, because it reminds us that the micro parts of the economy all come together to make the macro work.
That's right.
So thank you, Innes.
We're a sum of many parts.
Some of many parts, and no one is an island, and a whole bunch of other cliches.
Yeah.
Now, talking about which, one last question. The thesis of this podcast is, how do we build resilient and sustainable supply chains at a time when we are managing the 3 Ds of digitalisation, decarbonisation and diversification? I'm told that you have picked up on my brilliant alliteration and extended it to many more Ds. This can't be right, can it?
Yes, I talk about the 3 Ds that you talk about, James, because that's where business is grappling with, which is, as you talk about, decarbonisation, net zero by 2050 in its simplest form agenda, digitalisation, which is everything to do with the technology that we briefly talked about just before and beyond, to improve productivity, diversification. Again, you talked about ports perfectly, into diversifying into new product, new markets. But I also add to that 3 other Ds that businesses are grappling with. That's disruption, which is what we're seeing in terms of geopolitics at the moment, demography, the changing makeup of our population globally, move to urban centres over rural, our ageing population that we are having, particularly in our region. Japan went back 1 million people last year almost, as demography works against them. South Korea is the same. Much of Asia is the same. Demography is changing the way that businesses work and operate and need. It's also changing the way that that governments are allocating money. Think of the money that governments are going to have to spend in the years to come around aged care, health care, disability care, all of those things. You're going to see more government spending in those sectors as demography changes. And debt is the third issue that we keep talking about. Government debt in Australia at a federal and state level, which debt, the other side of that is spend. So government debt spend is increasing, and also how that's impacting on the private sector and on business debt, business carrying debt. So I talk about 6 Ds when I'm really at it, James, when I'm on a roll. I talk about decarbonisation, digitalisation, diversification, disruption, demography and debt. 6 Ds.
Well, I'll give you those. They're good. I can hear everyone listening saying to me, ask more questions about those last 3 because they're fascinating. But we'll have to do that some other time. Thank you so much, Innes.
Yeah, no problem, James. Always good to talk, and really love listening to your podcast. I learn a lot listening to them. So keep at it. Thanks, mate.
Well, see, we try and get interesting and informative people, and you've ticked those boxes. Well done.
Thanks, James. You take care.
You too. Thanks for another episode of Supply Circles. Thanks again to everyone for listening, and thanks for your feedback. If you have any feedback on today's interview with Innes Willox, or ideas for the show, or just want to give me some feedback, hit me up at james.scotland@aigroup.com.au or head over to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back in a fortnight with more business improvement insights into the keys to building sustainable supply chains. Thanks for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.